Good evening, brothers. Thank you for joining Alexandria-Washington Lodge number 22's Esoteric Corner. I am Brother Rob Swanson, the Lodge Education Officer of AW22 and your host for Esoteric Corner. This is one part of our attempts to further Masonic education to not only the brothers within our lodge, but thanks to Google Meet, we can extend that education to our brothers everywhere. It has been our goal to explore the esoteric or other Masonic topics and generate some interesting discussions. We will start with a presentation, followed by a Q&A and discussion. Just a few ground rules. As this is an untiled meeting, we cannot divulge any Masonic secrets, so please remember your obligations. Also, please be respectful of others' views and remain on the level. Topics can touch on a broader religious or political theme, but we will not advocate a particular religion or political view. Please remain respectful. Brother Ike Baker will be discussing the recovery of Hermetic and Neoplatonic texts by the Europeans, the transmission of these within the literate society of the time, and how this influenced the development of early modern Freemasonry. Brother Ike will also be discussing the theurgic reconstruction of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa in his 3 books of occult philosophy and additional works of the Renaissance period. Brother Ike is from Mount Hermon Lodge number 118 in Asheville, North Carolina, and hosts the podcast ARCANVM.
Thank you for having me this evening, brethren, to Alexandria-Washington Lodge's Esoteric Corner. Obviously, just to recapitulate, we're going to be talking a bit about Renaissance theurgy, particularly as it relates to Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's work, and then how that applies or might be interpreted within the overarching framework of Freemasonic ritual. I did not time this lecture, so I'm not sure how long it is, but I've done my best to keep it brief, although I mentioned to Brother Ron, anybody who knows me knows I struggle with being brief. However, in order to come here and to present to you and give you my, my best, I really wanted to cover quite a bit of ground in terms of the history. In order to give you context needed to understand how Freemasonry became the custodian of this spiritual system within the esoteric traditions, we do have to cover a bit of history. So I also do want to mention that this isn't necessarily a presentation strictly about Agrippa, but rather about the point at which the spiritual traditions of the ancient past re-entered into the Western world and consciousness, and how that was transmitted and through Freemasonry. So without any further ado, let's begin. I'm just going to present my screen. So the name of the presentation this evening is called Renaissance Theurgy and Freemasonry. Now, many of you may already be familiar with this word and its definition, but in the interest of being thorough, theurgy can be defined as a ritualized system of spiritual ascent. The word itself comes from the Greek theurgia, meaning God working. The best examples of the theory and philosophy behind theurgy as a rite of ascent is arguably from the 3rd and 4th century Syrian Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus of Chalcis. Iamblichus's work, entitled On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians, or On the Mysteries for short, details one of the most thorough explications of the philosophical conception of the gods of late antiquity, the nature of mankind, and of the soul. Iamblichus insists, not merely in accordance with Greek rationalistic philosophy, but according to the ancient rites of Egypt and Babylon, that ritualized ascent toward the divine is an imperative for the human soul. Now, while the Platonic school of philosophy, of which Neoplatonism was a part, flourished for over 1,000 years, the advent of an increasingly powerful and intolerant Christian church, unfortunately, combined with the decline and collapse of the Roman Empire, forced much of the religious and philosophical forms of quote-unquote paganism underground, so to speak. Much of these textual traditions are brought to the Perso-Arabic Islamic world at that time, around the 8th century. They are preserved, translated, studied, and elaborated there. So fast forward a bunch to the 15th century. Again, for the last several hundred years, the religio-philosophic traditions of the pre- and early Christian world are legendary in nature at this point. They're known but they're known only to the literati in fragments, as well as particularly through the lens of I guess that the Christian clerical understanding of these things. Some people might even call it propaganda, which is somewhat odd considering just how much Neoplatonism forms to this day the theology of the church, and particularly at that time. So in the 1400s, Italian scholar and translator for the Medici dynasty, Marsilio Ficino, he translates the Platonic and Neoplatonic works, which have been retrieved from parts east, quite literally sparking the Florentine Renaissance. Now, from his and others' translations, I would say that another exemplary translator at this time that people aren't necessarily always aware of, though it's more along the lines of Hermeticism, is Ludovico Lazzarelli. But from his and others' translations, the religio-philosophic canons of late antiquity are brought back to European intellectual society. It's a bit of an oversimplification to say that they came specifically through Ficino, though generally this is when it becomes available en masse, translated into Latin, and then now it's available for the literati of European society. Circulation and study of these texts, now made available by translation from into Latin from Arabic and Greek, had a tremendous influence on the intellectual circles, again, mostly clerical, of the next several centuries. Now, from this intellectual renaissance emerges Johannes Trithemius. He's a German abbot, a scholar, antiquarian, and an assumed magician who lived in the 14 and 1500s. Trithemius, he obviously he was higher up on the clerical chain of command. He was an abbot, and one of the things that he did to each one of his abbeys, the monasteries over which he was installed, was to create gigantic libraries. That was kind of his thing. He's maybe a precursor, 200 or 150 years before Elias Ashmole, or even a precursor of John Dee. So these people that assiduously collect and preserve these texts that are, you're not supposed to have. It was a little bit more hairy for him because he was within, clerical auspices, and it was a fine line. So he had a reputation as somebody engaged in clandestine and ultimately frowned upon operations of ceremonial magic. Again, however, he was fairly high in the clerical chain, and so while they moved him around quite a bit as a consequence of this, he was allowed enough leeway to remain an abbot, and he was never jailed or excommunicated. And during his tenure, he managed to train 2 apprentices. I love saying this name: Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus, and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. Those were his 2 young proteges, particularly the ones that we are aware of that grew to some prominence. So Paracelsus went on to become highly influential in the fields of alchemy and medicine of his day. Now, his version of alchemy was specifically geared towards the remedial application of alchemical processes to medicines. So rather than enriching himself, he wanted to enrich the health of people. That becomes kind of important later. Very interestingly, when you really boil down to it and you get to start reading people like Tobias Churton and just looking at the Confessio Fraternitatis, some of the early Rosicrucian pamphlets, it's really from Paracelsian teachings that the Rosicrucian movement ultimately seems to come forth from that. And then it's obviously there's a highly influence. It's very influential on a current of planetary magic of later centuries by way of texts such as the Grimoire of the Arbitel. In any event, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa goes on to influence the entirety of the occult and esoteric milieu, not only of his own time, but obviously until the present day. He was a theologian, a scholar, soldier, polymath. There was almost nothing he didn't do. He was exceptional in his teens at Latin. He actually, somewhat obnoxiously, he only spoke to people. He would only converse with certain people in Latin. Now, the 3 books of occult philosophy, the work for which he is most well known, this collection is Agrippa's Renaissance reconstruction of Iamblichian theurgy. Now, we didn't really go into too much detail about what Iamblichus, the particulars of his theurgic model was, and that's partly because in On the Mysteries, he gives us a cosmology somewhat. He gives us somewhat of a theology. He gives us a theory for theurgy as a rite of ascent. But what he really doesn't give us anything in the way of is actual theurgic praxis. So when we understand the theurgy of late antiquity, and we come back to examine or re-examine the 3 books of occult philosophy, we find really that it's a reconstruction of the praxis. It includes the theory, it includes the philosophy, and it includes the theology. The 3 books are essentially a manual for spiritual initiation. So how do we know this? Well, he specifically, Agrippa uses Neoplatonic derived spiritual hierarchies. He uses Greek words such as daimon to refer to the tutelary or psychopompic spirit. Some people would kind of conflate this with a holy guardian angel. That word quite literally comes from the Platonic literature, and it's a central part of the Iamblichian theurgy. There are other Latin cognates or synonyms for the Greek words in Iamblichus. For instance, a big word in Agrippa's Latin is sigillum, to represent what he calls signatures. That's a direct translation from Iamblichus's synthemata, which means conceptually the same thing. He quotes repeatedly throughout the work specific Neoplatonic philosophers. He mentions explicitly their works, the different concepts, and he does mention theurgy. A little bit of shameless self-promotion here. I did a course on the 3 books of occult philosophy with Jamie Paul Lamb and Mark Stavish, who are both brothers, for the Institute for Hermetic Studies. It's really a tremendous course. If anybody's interested in these parallels and correlations, this is going to be a pretty short lecture. You can go to the IHS website and check out the full thing there. So we know that Trithemius, the antiquarian book collector who amassed these tremendous libraries, there are usually actually appended to the beginning of certain editions of the 3 books, there are letters that Agrippa and Trithemius exchanged. It was a very long process of drafting the 3 books, and he consulted Trithemius, his mentor, who gave him notes. He even gave him his commentary on specific source materials. I believe, like the Emerald Tablet. That's a huge deal, actually, as a historical document. But in more recent erudition, it's been revealed that Agrippa didn't strictly work with Trithemius, but was in communication with a network of scholars, alchemists, ceremonialists, and initiates throughout Europe in the course of drafting his 3 books. In any event, the 3 books utilizes much of, if not the exact same system of cosmology and spiritual ascent that we find in Iamblichus's On the Mystery. Now, there's a really important addition for Agrippa's theurgy, and that's his Christian beliefs. His Christianity is of central importance. A lot of people think that he might have been anathematized or was kind of bucking the status quo. And he was in a certain way, because he was trying to essentially show that there's the spiritual science behind all this sort of degenerated folklore, right? Particularly in that period in Northern Europe, there's a tremendous German folk tradition. But on the same token, he didn't try to, like, write between the lines and kind of pretend he was a Christian. He was a very devout Christian, and he blended these things. It was as if the Christian component was really the inevitable eventuality of the work of theurgy. So yeah, to Agrippa, this sort of pre-Christian spiritual system and his Christian lowercase o orthodoxy were not in any way inharmonious or incompatible with the theurgic spiritual science he was committing to writing and trying to resurrect. One other thing, for the sake of being sort of thorough here with my attributions and as much as I can in a short period of time, it's really important that if you're going to study Agrippa and get into his stuff, that you also look at Marsilio Ficino's 3 books. So Ficino wrote 3 books on life, and he wrote that obviously, after translating all these theurgic, Neoplatonic, and Hermetic texts, really assimilating them, and it was a tremendous influence on Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. So I want to also clear one other point up. Many of you have probably heard of Agrippa, particularly in association with magic or the occult. So we need to define what we mean by magic, right? So what we mean here, specifically, right, theurgy, is spiritual or metaphysical techniques, specifically as applied to the ascent and purification of the soul in the divine. And again, that's called theurgy. Now, what Agrippa does, he takes 3 Greek words from antiquity, from the Greek and even the Hermetic literature. A lot of the Hermetic literature was written in Coptic and certain forms of Greek. Coptic is very similar to Greek. It borrows a lot of the Greek letters. But these 3 words that he pulls from the ancient sources are magia, goetia, and theurgia, which all refer to different types of metaphysical operations. But he uses magia, magic, as an umbrella term. And underneath that, he lists 2 contrasting types of magic, divided on one side into theurgia, divine ascent, and goetia on the other hand, which is sorcery, the conjuration of spirits for either material or intellectual gain. So one kind of reaches up towards the spiritual life, right, having to do with ascent, and the other reaches down toward the terrestrial life and its concerns. Much of Agrippa's work incorporated magic, specifically this kind of magic. It also incorporated astrology, and he was very heavy on Kabbalah, which is super, super important in Freemasonry. So the 3 books of occult philosophy begins by saying, quote, there is a 3-fold world. So the structure of the physical and metaphysical cosmos is delineated in a 3-fold structure. And obviously he's got 3 books. Each book deals with a different part of creation. You've got the natural world, that's the terrestrial, right, from that human georeferential point. Some people say geocentric. I like to borrow that term from Brother Lamb. Georeferential. It's how else can I view the world except from my perspective outward. And so that's the natural world. Then there's the celestial, which is having to do with the stars and the motions of the planets. And then finally, beyond all that is the divine, the noetic. That word, of course, coming from the ancient Greek nous, meaning mind, in an abstract sense, right? They didn't It didn't even cross a lot of their radars that your consciousness, your thinking mind, comes from a physical organ in your head. In fact, a lot of people, I think particularly Aristotle, believed that the gut was the source of intelligence, if any anatomical part. So a couple of things that Agrippa talks about. He talks about alchemy, but he talks about occult properties. That's kind of where we get this term, the occult. Occult, occultus in Latin, means hidden. Now it's got that, if you can see it, it's got occo, like ocular, oculus. So it's something specifically hidden from the eye. And what he means is properties of nature which you cannot physically see in motion. There's kind of a wheelwork of the universe behind everything. So the ultimate causation of all this wheelwork and of ultimately the material sphere is that the influence of the divine is constantly pouring, quote unquote, down toward us, toward the terrestrial sphere and man must ascend back upward toward the divine through the rites of theurgy. And obviously, right, there's a threefold structure, so you're having to sort of climb that celestial staircase. So the intermediary in between you and the divine is an ascent, specifically upwards. Now, this is in contradistinction to earlier traditions, right? You've got the Orphic and sort of Pythagorean. They went down. They went into the underworld. Theurgy specifically, particularly by the time of Plato, really, but when theurgy is later developed, it's all about going up or outward, really. So the celestial and heavenly spheres embody and further extend this chain of sympathy and causality. It's the root of all knowledge, the root of all information. Now, it's not advised that this be attempted haphazardly, but rather Agrippa and Iamblichus, but particularly what we have in Agrippa, he delineates a very methodical, systematic trajectory, a very careful ascent. But if we do look back to Iamblichus, and specifically the Neoplatonic tradition, we find something very interesting. There was a curriculum of study and progress of the individual, which we can call the ladder of virtues. So it was this whole curriculum was originally conceived of as a ladder with 6 rungs, each corresponding to a particular virtue to be acquired, not merely learned theoretically, but assimilated into the life and the character of the philosopher initiate. Iamblichus added a 7th to these. And these, you'll see 7 virtues listed here, but they're actually grouped into 3 specific categories. There's that threefold schema of ascent again. I listed these from, I guess, bottom up, backwards. So normally you'd think of it as an ascent, but here I have them listed in a reverse order. The first 3 of the virtues can be classed as the mundane virtues, and we'll go through them. The second group of 3 can be considered the philosophical or intellectual virtues. And then the last virtue, which is exclusive and which Iamblichus added, is the hieratic, meaning priestly or theurgic virtue. So the natural virtues concern the physical body, your health, your strength, your well-being. Really, what we're talking about when we talk about the natural virtues is temperance, right? And this can correspond to a number of things, being familiar with your entry-level Masonic lecture and sort of admonishments and the things included in the entered apprentice degree. Now, this wasn't as this was a little obvious for the Greeks. They were naturally, very, very physical, active people. They were on the whole, very temperate. It was a part of their culture. So the next virtue was the ethical virtues. And that's ways of being in the world which are respectful, honorable, and upright, right? Respect for yourself, your family, your friends, your community environment. They also referred to that as right opinion. The next virtue, completing the mundane or worldly virtues, would be the civic or political virtues, and that's your broader relationship to your community, right? Using that beneficial character you've developed to influence, to be a boon on your community, right? And not necessarily reserving those things for yourself, but giving them, knowing how to apply those things outward in your community. So next we move on to the second grouping, which is the philosophical virtues, being purificatory, contemplative, and paradigmatic. So the purificatory virtue is sort of, you begin this, I guess if the first three virtues, if the mundane virtues were more of a bodily association and conscientiousness, this is moving towards divine association. The contemplative virtues are sort of turning inwards, and while you've got all the mundane things, the political, the ethical virtues, kind of on, I don't want to say autopilot, but you've acquired that virtue. You've acquired it. So you move on, and now you're not associating too deeply. You're not too bound too tightly to worldly mundane concerns. This involved typically periods of fasting, meditation, knowing yourself. It was also spoken of as reason in reversion upon the self. And then capping off these, contemplative, I want to also add, there's the intellectual realm right there. That would be the realm of philosophical contemplation in the contemplative virtues. But then capping off the second grouping of the philosophic virtues is the paradigmatic. And this one is a little bit more, it's not as straightforward. Your consciousness is beginning to rarefy. So we're getting into abstract levels here. You're linking your soul to the paradigm, the archetype of the architect, right? You're embodying the virtues of what we would call the grand architect of the universe, the great architect of the universe. So then finally, we have the hieratic virtue, or the theurgic virtue. And this is where one was enabled to begin practicing theurgy. The rites of ascent and elevation happen here. That's really when you could truly begin to practice the spiritual rites, having mastered the subsequent two groupings. These were the mystery rites pertaining to the perfection of the soul, experience beyond the rational, beyond the intellectual. All previous virtues sort of limit that perfection to rational thought, whereas now we're becoming supra-rational, moving from known to unknown. And this obviously pertains to the immortality of the soul. And now, to cap off the ladder of virtues here, I truly believe the discerning Mason will find a threefold grade or degree structure in our Platonic ladder here. It essentially leads the candidate from an individual locus of philosophy, temperance, responsibility, expanding outward to family, friends, broader community. And from there, the initiate develops their mind to the utmost, learning philosophy until eventually transcending it. They begin to embody, to manifest in thought, word, and deed, the perfection of the divine, as much as is possible in an inherently imperfect realm. So this ladder or chain extending from the human to the divine mirrors exactly Agrippa's chain or hierarchy extending through the three worlds. Agrippa writes of the alchemical extraction of the spirit of things. He talks more about plants and stones, a purification of their physical matter to create a perfect substance for the health of all, And right, that echoes his peer and fellow student of Trithemius, Paracelsus. It's exactly what Paracelsus's entire movement was about. And they were students together. It is exactly this which Agrippa lays out in his theurgic magic, an alchemical extraction or purification of the soul of the human. He really speaks of alchemy as a spiritual process. Now, that idea itself, alchemy as applied to the human body, soul, and spirit, was posited by the 4th century Egyptian scribe priest, Zosimus of Panopolis. And he's got a funny name, but he's really, really important because he dates back to the 4th century CE. He was an actual priest in the Hellenistic Egyptian temples who specialized in the art of dyeing metals for religious statuary. This would have been alchemy. He says, Zosimus now, he remarks, quote, "The symbol of alchemy is drawn from the creation by its adepts who cleanse and save the divine soul bound in the elements and who free the divine spirit from its mixture with the flesh," end quote. Curiously, right, it's in the writings of Zosimus that we find very familiar allegories and images as are seen in the degrees of Blue Lodge Freemasonry. For instance, Zosimus mentions in his alchemical quote-unquote visions or sort of ecstatic revelatory dreams he had a staircase of 15 stairs leading to an altar. He mentions the plant acacia. He mentions it in terms of alchemical transformation. He describes various quote-unquote punishments or penalties which serve as alchemical initiations, such as dismemberment, cutting of the throat. And these are all analogies of the process of alchemical initiation in the raising of the candidate of a person from the base metal of lead to purified gold. So there's yet another analogy for the purification of spirit. So also significantly, it's from the works of Zosimus that we inherit the concept of the philosopher's stone. That's huge, right? Because he's the first on historical record that we have to refer to that. Nobody before, we don't have it anywhere referring to the goal of alchemy being the philosopher's stone. He calls it the stone which is not a stone and elaborates that it's formed of diverse metals under a particular astrological condition. Now, of interest to brethren of the craft, we find that the cultivation of a perfect stone is a central task of a Freemason. Yet, as in the tradition of alchemy, which speaks of such things as philosophical salt and philosophical gold, the rough ashlar and perfected stone is in much the same way an illusion, not with an I, with an A. It's an allusion to the cultivation of personal character rather than an actual physical stone, as in operative masonry. We also find that symbolism is the primary method of instruction in Freemasonry at large, right? Masonry itself being symbolic of the philosophical quote-unquote craftsman. Now, Agrippa, informed by the ancient knowledge of the past, is writing in the 1500s. And this is shortly before the Rosicrucian movement of the early 1600s. Around the same time, early Freemasonry is being formed, right? Excuse me. At that time, the birth of modern Freemasonry is taking place in Scotland, Ireland, and England, right? 1600s. Now, modern Freemasonry doesn't make any claims to possess nor instruct in alchemical knowledge, nor does it claim to have any historical affiliation with the quote-unquote original Rosicrucians, nor Agrippa. However, we see these ideas developing relatively contemporaneously with several points of significant commonality. Paracelsus and Agrippa are known to have been formative figures on the Rosicrucian movement. And then, you know, brothers such as John Byrom, who hosted the Kabbalah Club. Elias Ashmole, one of the earliest known Masons on historic record, tried to join the Rosicrucians, sent them letters. John Theophilus de Saguier, Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, also a member of Byram's Kabbalah Club. Sir Robert Moray, founder of the Royal Society. William Preston, a little later, the archetype, the architect of Blue Lodge ritual, and many others from the time period. They participated in the intellectual milieu of their time. And these were the early influential Masons. These men, along with many others, all had an intense interest. This is recorded. This is not opinion. In alchemy, Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, and magic. They were esotericists and they were occultists, and they were all Masons during its Masonry's formative period, contributing significantly in various ways, such as to its rituals, its lectures, and its overall culture. Another great example is William Preston's researches. He corresponded far and wide for, I believe it was a period of 7 years, trying to figure out what Freemasonry was in England and abroad on the continent, piecing together the ritual, the symbols, the ethos. And he exhibits all that in his work, the illustrations on Freemasonry, which becomes, the standard for lectures by way of Webb, Thomas Webb. But his lectures, if you look at the Prestonian lectures, which are available for free online, at least in part, I mean, there's a lot of Kabbalah, there's a lot of Platonism, there's a lot of the stuff that Agrippa had included in his work, and by name. It wasn't academic. There weren't footnotes or endnotes with citations, but he listed these things out as he wrote. So all this is to say that while Freemasonry may or may not have begun as a specifically esoteric society, it absolutely became one during this period. It inherited the spiritual traditions of the West through these men. You got to think of it this way. All this stuff, Agrippa, Paracelsus, the Rosicrucians, and then Freemasonry, that's all like 100 years. In the span of history, I mean, that is contemporaneous. That's it. That's basically the same time. So at this point, let's have a look at some of the correlations between our system of Agrippan theurgic magic and some features of the Blue Lodge. Obviously, we spoke of the threefold world, right? The threefold division of the ladder of virtues, the threefold hierarchical nature from man to the divine. And we've got our 3 craft degrees in Blue Lodge Freemasonry. Now, I want brethren to think about certain parts of, let's say, in the middle of their various initiations. There is some correlation, at least in some jurisdictions, ritual to different elements: water, air, fire. These are alchemical in nature. And the candidate, the initiate themselves, is representative of the earth, or the metal being worked upon, being transmuted. We've got the first degree, which corresponds to the natural world, the mundane virtues, right? That's very obvious. We've got the second degree, the philosophical virtues, the intellectual portion of everything, and this climbing of the ladder, or a staircase to the stars and beyond. This is the climbing of the celestial hierarchies to the summit of human knowledge, particularly alluding to astronomy and or the science of the stars and of geometry. So the most important thing I want to stress here in this entire system is you are going up. That's, when you think about it, it seems simplistic, but there's, Freemasonry is a beautiful system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. So that could correspond again to the occult properties in nature, the things behind the natural world that you have to spend time learning, corresponding to different types of knowledge as we go up this ladder to the point of finally going beyond human knowledge, and they're waiting, at least according to the North Carolina ritual, further instruction. The third degree, having a bit of a different tone, having associations with rebirth, again fitting perfectly in line with Agrippa's Christian beliefs. One of the main tenets, obviously, there being resurrection, being salvation. The third degree ultimately being of our ladder of virtues, being theurgic in nature. I would maybe not henosis yet, which is union with the divine, but as Agrippa likes to put it, perfection in that divine mind, that divine now working on you as a perfected stone. You are you are better fit for the builder's use at that point, not your own. So all this is not to say that Freemasonry comes directly from Agrippa, but that Agrippa, as our best and oftentimes most familiar source of Western esoteric, theurgic magic, and occultism, is really a nexus point through which we have received the Western esoteric traditions, specifically of spiritual ascent of the ancient past, late antiquity. We see it in the symbolism, we see it in the lectures, the Platonism, Pythagoreanism, alchemy, astronomy that was all incorporated into the symbolism, the degree lectures. Agrippa brings all these things together in his own work. And it may be our best reference in attempting to make sense of Freemasonry within the overall Western esoteric context today. Now, finally, this isn't very, very strong historical evidence, but it's somewhat suggestive, and I wanted to include it. Agrippa was a very well-traveled and learned man, and he was also a soldier. In 1510, at the age of 24, he was sent as an agent of Emperor Maximilian to the city of London to carry out a, quote, very secret mission. Of this mission, we know virtually nothing. It has been written in the scholar and critic Henry Morley's book on the life of Agrippa, that while staying in London, Agrippa met for discussions with a contemporary. And I'll read this quote. The secrets to be talked over between Cornelius and his friend related to that study of the mysteries of knowledge in which the theosophists assisted one another. Secret societies, chiefly composed of curious and learned youths, had by this time become numerous, and numerous especially among the Germans. Not only the search after the philosopher's stone, which was then worthy to be prosecuted by enlightened persons, but also the new realms of thought laid open by the first glance at Greek literature, and by the still more recent introduction of a study of the Hebrew language, occupied the minds of these associated scholars. Such studies often carried those who followed them within the borders of forbidden ground, and therefore secrecy was a condition necessary for their freedom of inquiry. Morley implies the organization of some secret group of Rosicrucians being formed during his stay there. And of this group, he writes lastly that they were engaged in, quote, the practice of initiation or secret incorporation, thus and then first introduced, has been handed down to our own times, and hence apparently the mysterious Eleusinian confederacies, now known as the lodges of Freemasonry. So now that basically concludes my presentation. These are some links